The day Margaret Whitmore's father died, she expected to inherit a fortune. What she did not expect was to inherit a child. Standing in the lawyer's office on that sweltering June afternoon in 1853, Margaret listened in horror as the attorney read the most shocking clause in her father's will. She was to raise and educate 8-year-old Samuel, a black boy born to one of her father's enslaved women, or forfeit her entire inheritance. For a woman who had publicly sworn she would never touch a black person, who had built her reputation on her extreme views about race and slavery, this was not just an inheritance, it was a test she never wanted to take. Columbia, South Carolina, June 1853. Margaret Whitmore was 22 years old and had just become an orphan. Her mother had died 5 years earlier, and now her father, Judge Henry Whitmore, one of the most respected legal minds in South Carolina, had succumbed to a sudden heart attack at age 58. Margaret had been her father's pride and joy, educated, articulate, beautiful in the conventional style of Southern belles. She was everything a wealthy planter's daughter should be. But Margaret had distinguished herself in Columbia society for something else: her unusually vocal and extreme views on race. While most white women of her class simply accepted slavery as the natural order of things, Margaret was evangelical about it. She spoke at church gatherings about the biblical justifications for slavery. She wrote letters to newspapers defending the institution against Northern abolitionists. She organized charitable events for deserving white families while refusing to acknowledge the humanity of enslaved people at all. Margaret had a particular phobia about physical contact with black people. She would not shake hands with free black people she encountered in town. She refused to allow enslaved house servants to dress her or fix her hair, insisting that only white servants could touch her. She carried gloves specifically to avoid any accidental contact. She had been heard saying at dinner parties, "I would rather die than allow a Negro to lay hands on me." Her views were extreme even by the standards of antebellum South Carolina, and while some found them distasteful, others admired her purity and conviction. She had received 3 marriage proposals from prominent men who saw her as the ideal wife, someone who would never be tempted to the kinds of relationships with enslaved people that plagued so many plantation households. Judge Henry Whitmore had seemed to support his daughter's views. He was known as a strict but fair jurist, a man who enforced slave codes rigorously but without unnecessary cruelty. He attended church every Sunday, contributed to respectable charities, and maintained an impeccable public reputation. But Henry Whitmore had been living a double life. The day after the funeral, Margaret sat in the office of her father's attorney, Jonathan Prescott, expecting a straightforward reading of the will. She knew she was the sole heir. Her father had been wealthy, owning not only their townhouse in Columbia, but also a profitable rice plantation outside the city with 42 enslaved workers. Attorney Prescott was visibly uncomfortable as he opened the will. "Miss Whitmore, before I begin, I must warn you that your father's will contains certain unusual provisions." "Unusual how?" Margaret asked, impatient to get through the formalities. Prescott cleared his throat and began to read. The first sections were standard. The house, the plantation, the investments, all left to Margaret. But then came a clause that made Margaret's blood run cold. Item 7. I hereby bequeath to my daughter Margaret Whitmore the responsibility for the care, upbringing, and education of Samuel, age 8 years, son of Rose, currently enslaved at Whitmore Plantation. Margaret shall raise Samuel in her household as her ward, ensure he receives a proper education, and provide for his welfare until he reaches the age of 21. Upon Samuel reaching majority, Margaret shall grant him his freedom papers and provide him with a sum of $5,000 to establish himself in a free state. Margaret stared at the attorney in disbelief. "What is this?" Prescott continued reading, his voice steady but sympathetic. Should Margaret refuse this responsibility or fail to fulfill these conditions to the satisfaction of the executors of this will, her entire inheritance shall be forfeited and donated to the American Colonization Society for the purpose of relocating free black people to Liberia. The room spun. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair. "This is insane. My father would never—" "There's more," Prescott said quietly. He continued reading. "I acknowledge that Samuel is my biological son, born of Rose in the year 1845. I have failed him in life by not acknowledging him publicly. I will not fail him in death. My daughter Margaret has the intelligence, resources, and Christian duty to provide Samuel with the opportunities I could not give him while living. I trust she will prove herself worthy of her inheritance by proving herself capable of Christian charity and human compassion. Margaret stood up abruptly. This is a forgery. My father would never write such a thing. He would never acknowledge a bastard child born of a slave, and he certainly would never ask me of all people, to raise him. Miss Whitmore, I assure you this will is genuine. It was signed and witnessed properly. I was present when your father executed it 6 months ago. He was of sound mind and clear intention. 6 months ago? He knew he was dying? He had been warned by his physician that his heart was failing. He wanted to ensure his affairs were in order. Margaret paced the small office, her mind racing. I won't do it. I refuse. Give the money to the Colonization Society. I don't care. Prescott leaned forward. Miss Whitmore, perhaps you should take some time to consider. Your father's estate is worth approximately $80,000. That is not a sum to dismiss lightly. Without it, you will have nothing. No home, no income, no prospects. I have marriage prospects, Margaret said firmly. Do you? Prescott asked gently. Your father's will is now a public document. Everyone in Columbia will know about Samuel. They will know about your father's relationship with Rose. Some of your suitors may find this complicating. Margaret's face flushed with anger and humiliation. Her father had not only betrayed everything she believed in, he had trapped her. If she refused, she would be penniless. If she accepted, she would have to violate every principle she had ever claimed to hold in front of the entire community that had admired her for those principles. I need to see him, Margaret said finally. This boy, Samuel. Of course, he's currently at the plantation with his mother, Rose. Margaret left the office in a daze. She spent the night in her father's house, alone except for 2 white servants pacing the floors, reading and rereading the will, trying to find some loophole, some way out. But there was none. Her father had been a judge. He knew how to write an ironclad legal document. The next morning, Margaret rode out to the plantation, a journey of about 12 miles. She had been there only a handful of times in her life. Her father had managed it through an overseer, and Margaret had preferred to stay in Columbia rather than face the reality of the enslaved people whose labor supported her comfortable life. The overseer, a man named Gideon Cross, met her at the main house. Miss Whitmore, my condolences on your father's passing. How can I help you? I need to see Rose and her son. Cross's expression became guarded. Of course, I should tell you, miss, that Rose and the boy have been living in the cabin closest to the main house. Your father insisted on certain accommodations for them. The boy doesn't work in the fields. He's been learning to read and write from a tutor your father hired. Margaret felt fresh waves of shock. My father hired a tutor for a slave child. Yes, miss, a free black man from Charleston comes twice a week. Margaret followed Cross to a small cabin that was, she had to admit, in better condition than the others. It had glass windows, a proper door, and a small garden in front. Rose answered the door. She was about 35 years old, tall and dignified, with eyes that showed both fear and defiance as she recognized Margaret. Miss Whitmore, Rose said quietly. I'm here to see Samuel. Rose hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the cabin was clean and surprisingly well furnished. There were books on a shelf, a table with chairs, even a small mirror on the wall. A boy sat at the table reading. He looked up as Margaret entered. Samuel was small for 8 years old, with his father's high forehead and serious eyes. He looked at Margaret with curiosity, but no fear. Samuel, this is Miss Margaret, your father's daughter, Rose said carefully. I know who she is, Mama, Samuel said. His voice was clear, his diction perfect. Papa told me about her. Margaret felt as though she'd been slapped. He told you about me? Yes, ma'am. He said you were his daughter and that you were very smart, but that you had some wrong ideas about people like me. He said he hoped you would learn better. The audacity of it took Margaret's breath away. Her father had discussed her with this child, had criticized her views to him, had given him hope that she might change. "What else did he tell you?" Margaret asked, her voice tight. Samuel looked at his mother, who nodded slightly. "He said that when he died you would take care of me, that you would teach me things and help me be free someday. He said you were the only person he trusted to do it right." Margaret wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Her father trusted her to raise his illegitimate black son when she had spent her entire adult life proclaiming her contempt for black people. "And you believed him?" Margaret asked. Samuel shrugged. "He was my papa. He didn't lie to me." Margaret left the cabin without another word. She rode back to Columbia in a fury, planning to tell Attorney Prescott that she would forfeit the inheritance. She would rather be poor than be made a fool of, rather be penniless than betray her principles. But that night, lying in her bed in her father's house, Margaret began to think more clearly about what poverty would actually mean. She had no skills, no profession, no way to support herself. Her marriage prospects, as Prescott had pointed out, were now severely compromised. No respectable man would want to marry the daughter of a judge who had fathered a child with an enslaved woman. More than that, she began to think about what her father had written. "I trust she will prove herself worthy of her inheritance by proving herself capable of Christian charity and human compassion." It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down. Her father was essentially saying that she was incapable of basic human decency, that her principles were really just prejudices, that she lacked the courage to confront her own beliefs. Margaret Whitmore had never backed down from a challenge in her life. Over the next 3 days, she formulated a plan. She would accept the terms of the will. She would raise Samuel, but she would do it her way, maintaining her boundaries, her principles, her sense of order. She would treat it as a business arrangement. Samuel would live in her house, but he would have his own quarters. He would receive education, but at a distance. She would fulfill the letter of her father's will without compromising her beliefs. On the 4th day after her father's death, Margaret returned to Attorney Prescott's office and signed the papers accepting the terms of the will. "I will do what my father asked," she said coldly, "but do not expect me to enjoy it." Samuel arrived at Margaret's Columbia townhouse 1 week later. Margaret had prepared a small room in the attic for him, far from her own chambers. She had hired a tutor to continue his education. She had arranged for meals to be brought to his room so she wouldn't have to eat with him. She had planned everything to minimize contact. The first few weeks were exactly as Margaret had envisioned. Samuel stayed in his room or with the tutor. Margaret continued her social activities, though she noticed that some invitations had stopped coming. The scandal of her father's will had spread through Columbia society, and while some people were sympathetic, others were quietly judgmental. Margaret told herself she didn't care. She would fulfill her obligation for 13 years, free Samuel at 21 as required, and then resume her life. But Samuel had other ideas. He didn't stay in his room as she'd expected. He came downstairs. He asked questions. He wanted to know about the books in her father's library. He asked about her mother, his half-siblings, if there were any, there were not, about Columbia, about the world beyond the plantation. And despite herself, Margaret found herself answering. It started with brief exchanges, then longer conversations. Samuel was remarkably intelligent, well-read beyond his years, curious about everything. Margaret, who had always prided herself on her own education, found herself challenged by his questions. "Miss Margaret," he asked one evening in August, about a month after arriving, "why do you think black people shouldn't be free?" It was a question no one had ever asked her so directly. In her social circles, such things were simply accepted as truth. "Because you are not capable of self-governance," Margaret said, repeating what she had been taught, what she had always believed. "It is the natural order. The Bible supports it." "What part of the Bible?" Samuel asked. Margaret cited the usual passages. The curse of Ham, Paul's letters about slaves obeying masters. Samuel listened carefully. Then he said, "My tutor, Mr. Wesley, showed me other passages about how Moses led enslaved people to freedom, about how Jesus said to love your neighbor as yourself, about how Paul said there is neither slave nor free in Christ. Why are those passages less important?" Margaret had no good answer. She had never been challenged on the biblical justification for slavery, by someone who had actually read the Bible carefully. Their conversations continued. At first, Margaret remained rigid, defending her positions. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, cracks began to form in her certainty. The turning point came in October. Samuel fell ill with a fever. For 3 days, he burned with illness, delirious and weak. The doctor said it was influenza and could be dangerous for a child. Margaret found herself at his bedside constantly. At first, she told herself it was because she would lose her inheritance if he died. But as the hours passed, as she wiped his forehead with cool cloths, as she held water to his lips, as she watched him struggle to breathe, she realized something that terrified her. She cared whether he lived or died, not because of the money, but because he was a child who was suffering. A child who had done nothing to deserve illness or pain, or the circumstances of his birth. On the third night, Samuel's fever broke. He woke in the early morning hours to find Margaret asleep in a chair next to his bed, her hand resting on his arm. When she woke and realized where her hand was, she pulled it back quickly. She had touched him, skin to skin. The thing she had sworn she would never do. And the world had not ended. The sky had not fallen. She felt no contamination, no horror. She felt only relief that he was alive. Samuel looked at her with those serious eyes that reminded her so much of her father. "Thank you for taking care of me, Miss Margaret." Something broke inside her in that moment. Some wall she had built around her heart. Some fortress of prejudice and fear and false certainty. "You're welcome, Samuel," she said quietly. From that day forward, things changed. Margaret stopped trying to keep Samuel at a distance. She allowed him to eat meals with her. She began teaching him herself alongside the tutor. She took him on walks through Colombia, ignoring the stares and whispers. She began to listen when Samuel talked about his mother, still enslaved at the plantation, about his friends in the slave quarters, about the pain of being separated from them, about the arbitrary cruelty of a system that treated human beings as property. And for the first time in her life, Margaret allowed herself to really see what slavery was. Not the sanitized version she had been taught, not the biblical justifications, not the economic arguments, but the reality. Human suffering on a massive scale, justified by nothing more than the accident of skin color. In December of 1853, 6 months after her father's death, Margaret did something that shocked everyone who knew her. She went to Attorney Prescott's office and asked him to draw up manumission papers for Rose. "I want to free Samuel's mother," she said. "Can I do that?" Prescott was stunned. "You own her as part of your inheritance, so yes, you can free her. But Miss Whitmore, this is quite a change from who I was," Margaret interrupted. "Yes, it is. Draw up the papers." Rose was freed on Christmas Day, 1853. Margaret gave her a small house in Colombia and helped her find work as a seamstress. For the first time in his life, Samuel could live with both his mother and his half-sister under the same roof, not as property but as people. The transformation of Margaret Whitmore became the talk of Colombia. Some admired her Christian charity. Others said she had gone mad with grief. Still others whispered that she had betrayed her race and her class. Margaret found that she didn't care what they said anymore. Over the next several years, Margaret's views continued to evolve. She began quietly helping other enslaved people on her plantation. She hired tutors to teach them to read, which was illegal in South Carolina. She improved their living conditions. She stopped using the overseer's whip for discipline. In 1856, she made the radical decision to free all 42 enslaved people on her plantation and offer them paid labor contracts instead. The scandal was enormous. She was ostracized from Columbia society completely. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. She was called a traitor, a fool, a danger to the Southern way of life. But Margaret had found something more valuable than social acceptance. She had found her conscience. When the Civil War began in 1861, Margaret used her remaining fortune to help formerly enslaved people escape to the north. Her house became a stop on the Underground Railroad, a secret that would have gotten her arrested if discovered. Samuel, by then 16 years old and exceptionally well educated, worked alongside her in this dangerous mission. In 1863, when Samuel turned 18, Margaret presented him with his freedom papers as required by his father's will, though he had effectively been free for years. "I don't need these," Samuel said. "President Lincoln freed all enslaved people in Confederate states. Keep them anyway," Margaret said. "Legal documentation matters. Your father knew that." Samuel went north to attend Oberlin College in Ohio, one of the few institutions that admitted black students. He studied law, following in his father's footsteps. Margaret stayed in South Carolina through the War and Reconstruction, using what remained of her fortune to establish schools for formerly enslaved children. In 1872, Samuel returned to South Carolina as one of the first black lawyers in the state. He worked on behalf of freedmen trying to claim their rights under the new constitutional amendments. Margaret and Samuel remained close until her death in 1885 at age 54. She had never married, dedicating her life instead to education and civil rights work. At her funeral, Samuel delivered the eulogy. He spoke of a woman who had been given a test she never wanted to take and had passed it in ways no one could have predicted. "Margaret Whitmore was my father's greatest gamble," Samuel said. "He bet that confronted with an actual human being. Forced to see a child not as a political position but as a person, his daughter would choose humanity over prejudice. He was right. But it took courage that few people possessed to admit she had been wrong about everything she believed. My father gave me life, but Margaret gave me a future. And in the process, she gave herself a future too, one based not on hate and fear, but on love and justice." Samuel Whitmore went on to become a prominent civil rights lawyer during Reconstruction. He represented freedmen in land disputes, fought against discriminatory laws, and helped establish schools throughout South Carolina. In 1896, he published a memoir titled The Judge's Son, A Testament to Transformation. In it, he detailed his father's unusual will and his sister's remarkable journey from racial extremist to advocate for justice. The book created a sensation, particularly among white Southerners, who saw in Margaret's story the possibility of redemption, the idea that even deeply held prejudices could be overcome through human connection. Margaret's letters and journals, preserved by Samuel and eventually donated to the University of South Carolina, provide an extraordinary record of her transformation. In her early 20s, she wrote, "I believe in the absolute separation of the races as ordained by God and nature. To violate this order is to invite chaos and degradation." By her 40s, she wrote, "I believed I was defending civilization. I did not understand that I was defending barbarism. Every argument I made for slavery was a lie I told myself to avoid confronting my own capacity for cruelty." Samuel did not change my mind through argument. He changed it by being himself, intelligent, kind, curious, fully human, and I had to choose whether to acknowledge that humanity or cling to my comfortable lies. Thank God I chose humanity. The story of Margaret Whitmore and Samuel Whitmore remains one of the most powerful narratives of transformation from the Civil War era. It demonstrates that even the most extreme prejudices can be overcome, but only through personal relationship, through being forced to see the humanity in those we have been taught to hate. Judge Henry Whitmore's gamble, that his daughter could be forced to confront her racism by making her responsible for an actual human being rather than an abstract political position, was an unusual strategy. Some historians have criticized it as manipulative, as using a child as a tool for his daughter's moral education, but Samuel himself never saw it that way. In his memoir, he wrote, "My father could have simply freed me in his will. He could have given me money and sent me north, but he knew that wouldn't change anything. Margaret would have continued spreading her poison, influencing others, contributing to the system that enslaved millions. By forcing her to know me, to care for me, to see me as a person, he didn't just save me, he saved her. And through her, he saved countless others she went on to help. Was it manipulative? Perhaps. But it was also brilliant, and it worked." Today, the Whitmore House in Columbia still stands, now a museum dedicated to Reconstruction-era history. In the attic room where Samuel first lived when he arrived in 1853, there is an exhibit about his life and Margaret's transformation. On the wall is a quote from Margaret's journal, written in 1865, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. "I was once a woman, who swore she would never touch a black person. Now I am a woman who thanks God every day that I was forced to break that vow. In touching Samuel's fevered forehead that October night, I touched my own humanity for the first time. Everything I had believed was stripped away, and what remained was the simple truth. We are all human beings, equally worthy of dignity, respect, and love. My father gave me an inheritance I didn't want. In accepting it, I inherited something far more valuable than money. I inherited a soul.